Anybody got any regulations that are driving markets? Okay.
Actually, in the building sector, there are much tougher building code requirements for efficiency, for insulation values, and so on. So that is driving.
Right. If you look at LEED, LEED's made a huge difference in the expectation of new buildings, but not much for old buildings. Yes, sir.
In the work that I'll talk about later on today, a lot of the regulations and the changes, and a lot of the changes in what's being required for FEMA and flood management in cities is driving a change in the type of infrastructure that we use. And that ultimately changes how, as cities, we utilize energy at a larger scale. Pumps, how we're dealing with all of our stormwater management, which is another one of those big chunks of energy that we don't think about. So that's helping us because that infrastructure needs to be retooled. It's an opportunity for us to go in and talk about how we do that in a way that's more energy efficient on a lot of levels, both ecologically, but also in terms of how we use gravity instead of pumps, right?
Is there a set of regulations? Is there a set of regulations that's driving that's codified or something that we could share?
Yeah, it's the Federal Record 2611, I think. It's the new FEMA regulations.
All right, I'll get that from you. And what we'll do,
Yeah.
I think this whole idea of driving regulation and driving law is really, really important to drive it around performance standards. How much economic work is accomplished per unit of energy consumed?
I would like to comment to what Chris said about paradigm shift. So how to change the mind of people. I think we are lacking a main component in the society, which is actually very important. When you think about all religions in the world, they are based on something quite similar, which is generosity, love. But none of the religious leaders had been really involved in this energy question. So if there is a start of communication between religious leader and then this energy problematic, and because it's all related to basically altruism, so being generous and think about each other. So this is the trends. I mean, if we continue in the trends we are at the moment, is that we want to have more comfort, and we don't want to get rid of our comfort in our hotel room or whatever. But if you want to face the energy problems, then we need actually to do that. But it's not going to happen if there is not a major change in the mind of people. They don't grasp in the everyday life that it's actually related to more important question is about how to behave with each other in the world, with a neighbor, it's just about generosity, basically. So I think this is an important component, that is maybe a first step in your direction, is try to have this connection with religions and energy questions, and bring that together, that they discuss those energy questions in I don't know, in a different kind of type of temple or church or whatever. I don't care, but I think this is important.
I think this is very important. I think that we have been concentrating too much on the profit motive. That everything has to work out financially to the profit who produces it. Of course, there's realities to deal with, but in the past we have also had very big investments in our culture and transportation and so on, and it wasn't always the short-term financial profit.
One thing about profit, though, is, all right, so if you look at drivers and you take altruism, which is people wanting to act good, and you take regulation, which is governments coercing them to behave well. Profit is our own self-interest. So our point when we're building our transportation networks, we look at it and say, if I save you a car payment per month, in other words, I make it so you go from 2 cars in your family to 1, then you are going to be self-interested to do the right thing. And self-interest drives things in a very consistent way. If you save people $200-300 a month, they will do that more often. If you cost them, if you tell them you need to do this just because it's nice, they will do it for a while. But it's not reliable if it gets uncomfortable, or it's too hard, or it's too inconvenient, or it's too hot. They will start to drift off.
So there is another aspect. So is it fun to, go rather than in a car that doesn't connect to the environment, but to walk and see what's going on in town and relate to people, or take a bus where you talk to someone? Anyhow,
But actually on a bus, buses produce 0.6 pounds of CO2 per passenger mile. Cars produce 0.45. Buses produce more carbon per passenger mile than cars. There's no green bus. Trains are slightly more efficient, slightly less polluting, but cost twice as much to ride as a car. So the reason we drive cars is because, how many of you know anything about Six Sigma or just-in-time manufacturing processes? Okay, so the bigger the batch, the poorer the quality. You need to tailor the trip to the traveler. So if you want things to be convenient, things have to be convenient. A bike is convenient, but in most of our cities it's unsafe to ride. So you have to make it so that it falls within the self-interest of people to do things. So I'll add, right now we have altruism, regulation, fun, self-interest or profit. Go ahead, I'm going to get it, so this is in a bigger font.
Well, there are 2 levels being looked at here. The first is, without the appropriate vision, nothing is possible. This has to come from a higher level, and it has to be transmitted through policy down to people. So we're talking about incentives, right? I'm going to paraphrase badly, but Charlie Munger is the right-hand man of Warren Buffett. And he said, I'm quoting badly here, he said, "I've always known that incentives are really important to driving human behavior. But the older I get, the more I realize how badly I underestimated that. Incentives are everything." So look at this. Gasoline went from $4 to $2 a gallon in the United States. What's the most popular selling car in America right now? It's the Ford F-150. It's followed by a Chevy Tahoe or some equivalent SUV, followed by something else. This is a 15-year investment you're making on whatever gas prices were 3 weeks ago, right? So the incentives are critical in this story. But waiting for people to do the right thing because they're getting the right signals from just the pure profit side of this won't work. This has to be conducted at a higher level. There has to be a vision that somebody's holding at a higher level that then gets transmitted in some important way, or this just won't work, because incentives are everything in this story. So a lot of needs.
I am Paul Oquist. I am Minister of National Policy in Nicaragua and Private Secretary of the President. In our experience, another driver has been predictability. We are the second poorest country in Latin America and the Caribbean. We have gone from 25% renewable energy, which was hydroelectric, both of the producers of that renewable energy, in 2007, to 56% of our generation last year was renewable energy. And predictability has been important in that, because how does the second poorest country finance this? Well, it's been through the private sector. It's been through foreign direct investment of the private sector. And the mechanism that has been used is concessions, 20 and 30-year concessions linked to design, finance, build, operate, transfer projects, BOT. So the companies get a 30-year concession or a 20-year concession, and then they do the design, they finance, they build, they operate, and in 20 or 30 years they'll transfer. Most of them give 10% to our national generation company that owns the two hydroelectrics I mentioned before, called Enel. It is a good idea. It's a good idea to bring the country in on the deal and for them to see that all of the maintenance is being done, all of the repairs are being done according to schedule and the maintenance, because they're going to inherit this in 20 years or 30 years. It's going to be turned over to them. And so that dispels any suspicions that it's being decapitalized or what have you. The other driver of the predictability is that they sign a power purchasing agreement with the distributor. Our situation is that our generation is mostly private, our transmission is 100% public, and the distribution is 100% private. It's a Spanish firm that is doing the distribution. So they signed this purchasing power agreement, the PPA, with the Spanish distributor, and it has a rising scale of prices within a price table. The Ministry of Energy has a price table. It's not a set price because projects vary on their characteristics, but it's the range of prices, and that's where you get the starting price. But then this other increment, this escalator, which wraps up the predictability, is based on suppositions about the future of the US dollar, which is the currency involved. That the US dollar will not have a set rate over 20 years or 30 years, so you're making some suppositions about that. But what this all introduces, the concession, the purchasing power agreement, and that escalator, is absolute predictability. And this can be sold to someone else with all of the financials based on a given set of predictions of what it's going to be like in year 10 and year 15 and year 20. So this has been an experience in a very poor country, the second poorest country in Latin America and the Caribbean, in which has allowed this to go from 25% to 56% with a nice mix of hydroelectric, geothermal, wind power, biomass, and most recently solar. Solar is the recent addition, because when solar had a higher price it wasn't on the radar screen. But now solar is interesting, is very interesting at current prices. And our long-range plans are being changed somewhat with the long line pounding on the door, asking for licenses to do solar projects. The same can be said of geothermal projects, as we have a mountain chain that's geothermal, has 2,000 megawatts of potential in geothermal, and also Lake Nicaragua, the southern half, is one of the areas of greatest constant wind in the world. Our turbines work 58% of the time on an annualized basis at the southern end of Lake Nicaragua. They're all private enterprises. Whereas in the North Sea, if it's churning 35% of the time, it's a great project. And the Polish minister said 20% in Poland is a good wind project. In Nicaragua, it's 58%. And in terms of the solar, northwestern Nicaragua has a radiation at over 5,800 units per square meter, whereas in Northern Europe they're also working with 2,500, 3,000, 2,800 units per square meter. I've often thought it's curious that when you go look into flying into these places that you fly into, and there's very few solar panels, When you fly into Germany and Netherlands and Sweden, there's lots of them all over the place. And that's exactly the area where there's least sunshine in the world, of the populated world. So maybe we can move them out to where there's some sunshine too.
I think your comment on watts per square meter is a really good one, because you have to look at it and say, if we're going to live within a solar budget, how do we drive our energy consumption within the watts per square meter that are achievable?
My name is Washaka. I'm the Director of Economic Policy for the Federations of Aboriginal Nations of America, FANA. I want to call back to both you, and you mentioned something we're kind of keeping to the edge, which is the emotional tie-in, which is what really drives big change. And we're mostly talking about the economic drivers. There's an interesting result Switzerland got when they wanted to figure out where to place their nuclear waste. So they put out an appeal to all the cantons that would you be willing to deal with putting nuclear waste in your town? This is something we have to all do together for the importance of progressing as a people. So we need to do this. 54% of the cantons said they were in favor. Then they came out with a policy and switched the discussion from we need to do this together and appeal to our higher good to we will give you this much money if you'll do it. And they went, oh, it's an economic decision. Everybody, 23% signed up. Big lesson that comes out of that, which is we still have to not lose the appeal to people's higher nature, because they would like to do the right thing, but we just have to be clear and one voice.
Nisu Wishawana, Director General of the Federation of Aboriginal Nations of America. Aguni, peace be unto you all here. I was wondering, particularly when we're speaking about vision, where we see the potential for connecting with indigenous groups, particularly from a vision standpoint. There seems to be so much attention right now, talk about wanting to work with indigenous groups, wanting to see them develop. This just seems like a fantastic opportunity to begin to look in that regard in terms of creating a vision and giving something that people can buy into and feel passionate about. I'd be very interested in having a conversation about that, and we're actually based right out of Rhode Island. So to the individuals doing work in our neighboring state of Massachusetts, what you're doing around transportation, I think would be also an excellent opportunity for discussion. I recently had the opportunity to meet with the Secretary of Commerce from Rhode Island, discussing coming up here to the World Energy Forum, and looking at other means of doing innovative things in the state outside of what's been going on. So when we're talking about vision, I'm wondering what you see the potential for partnering or working with indigenous groups are in terms of creating that.
That's a fantastic question, and let's connect afterwards, because I do podcasts all the time on a variety of subjects, and this one is important. I just did one on the Dakota Access Pipeline piece a while back, because to me that's not so much a pipeline issue as it shows one of the largest gatherings of indigenous peoples coming together and saying, we're protectors, we're not preventers, we're protectors of something. And so I have 3 E's in my story. I told you about 2 of them, economy, energy. The third one's environment. And unless we have all 3 of those firmly in view, to the extent we're just focused on the economy, we're going to screw it up with the rest of them. This is now a worldwide thing. We have to look at all 3 together. And so this is the higher level vision, I think, and I think this is what the indigenous cultures could possibly help the larger world with, is we have to move from a framework of where we have extractive, destructive institutions, practices, and political frameworks to something that's relational and regenerative. And there's movement happening in that direction. But if we're not in harmony and balance with the larger world, all of this is for nothing. We could make $1 billion, skrillion, but if we acidify the oceans and destroy the phytoplankton, forget about it. So we have to have all 3 of these things now in balance: economy, energy, environment. All 3 have to be in the same room, because if we got a bunch of energy people, you get energy solutions. You get the economic people, and they're doing economic solutions, and the environmental people are over here doing their stuff. And until all of them are in the same spot, we're just spinning our wheels. Personal view. So, thanks.
I think that the indigenous people are actually, they could have a very important role in inspiring us because of their traditions. And one of the things that for 20 years has always been quoted is that you plan for the 7th generation which comes from indigenous people, and that's such a beautiful thought. And I think, you know, you can inspire us.
Well, the other way to say that is we're not giving this land, passing it on to our children. We're borrowing it from them. You know what I'm saying? That's all I had to say, sorry. We're not passing the land on to our children. We're borrowing it from them. Okay, put your head in the right.
There's a particularly great letter, "The Earth Belongs to the Living," that was written by Thomas Jefferson to James Madison on September 6, 1789, when he was watching the French kingdom collapse under debt. And it is all about that you cannot use up the usufruct of the land. Usufruct means to use for profit without harm. And you cannot use up the usufruct of the land for generations to come. It is a really powerful letter. I really recommend you look at it. Another book that fits into exactly the extractive institutions that you mentioned and culture and inclusive institutions was recently published. It was Why Nations Fail: The Origins of Power, Prosperity, and Poverty. And it is highly oriented around inclusive institutions. And if you think about extractive industries, they are essentially consuming industries as opposed to net producing. And so this idea of going from extractive to inclusive is that book lays it out incredibly well.
Good morning. My name is Ifi Ikono. I'm the Executive Director of Eco Green Foundation. It's in Accra, Ghana. I actually want to bring up one or two issues when it comes to energy efficiency, actually looking from the point of view of somebody coming from sub-Saharan Africa. One issue I haven't seen talked about here is the issue of affordability. That obviously might not be an issue in this part of the world, but from where I come from, why there might be the need and there's a drive to encourage renewable energy forms, to encourage energy efficient appliances and all of that. One of the major drawbacks that we've had in the region has to do with the issue of affordability. So, for instance, let's look at the issue of solar home systems, issue of people trying to move away from thermal power production, which is dominant in West Africa, to renewable energy. You look at the cost factor, and you discover that even though I come from a region where we have abundant renewable energy sources, the fact that the average person still cannot afford solar home systems, cannot afford to pay the higher tariff rates for renewable energy, makes it an encumbrance to people who would have ordinarily opted to move from the more conventional energy sources to renewable energy sources. So this is one area where our governments are trying to find ways of ensuring that we are able to tap into the huge renewable energy potentials actually within the region, because of course we have summer all year round. Solar is a big option, just like wind energy. But the cost of that vis-a-vis, say, cost of thermal power is still much, much higher. So we need to look at that as one of those drivers that would actually help in talking about more efficient home systems. And of course, even the energy efficiency itself too is a real issue. I do agree to a large extent that the regulation has a large part to play in perhaps trying to steer behavior one way or the other. In Accra, for instance, there was a time that the government came up with a regulation, making it mandatory for all consumers to change from the incandescent light bulbs to the CFLs and the LEDs and all of that. It was all well and good, but the fact on the ground would still remain that if you still could not even afford to make those changes, even when we know that they are far more efficient. So of course the government had to come in with an incentive package that would, at least in the first instance, let people be able to afford even things as basic as light bulbs. So I think that is an issue. Then another issue that I really want to talk about is also the issue of energy efficiency, energy sustainability vis-a-vis the role of women, basically. So, and then gender mainstreaming is something that we are paying a lot of attention to where I come from, because of the fact that the huge gap between energy supply and energy demand, and the fact that to a large extent we still use very inefficient ways of of cooking, for instance, like using open wood sources vis-a-vis gas or electric cookers, means that women, to a large extent, are always at the receiving end of some of those byproducts of poor energy utilization. For instance, it's been proved that we've had large cases of cancer from women actually inhaling open smoke from using wood to cook. Perhaps if they could afford to use electricity, to use gas, that is something that would at least prevent or reduce some of those health challenges. And women have to get up very early in the morning, maybe spend hours trying to find, wood and all of that for cooking. Vis-a-vis, if we had more efficient systems that would allow those same women save those hours and use clean energy sources. So these are some of the areas that maybe may not be very applicable to this part of the world, but it's something that you have as part and parcel of daily existence in sub-Saharan Africa. So while it is all well and good to promote energy efficiency, to promote clean sources of energy, it's also very important to begin to look at it more holistically, in the sense of how do we ensure that more and more people come out of that poverty level? How are people going to be encouraged to make sure that we have less people, are living on just $1 a day? Because if you continue to live within that earning threshold, it's almost impossible, regardless of how well you want to change your thinking, how well you want to really move from being less energy efficient to being much more efficient, if you cannot afford it. So I think affordability is a key that we should begin to look at. Thank you.
Well, yeah, energy access comes before energy efficiency. It
Certainly.
doesn't do any good to be efficient if you have no access.
That is very true as well.
So, Nick, I'm wondering if your micro thing has any...
It does. Hopefully, yeah, I can address that. The good news, and you're correct, I've actually spent time in sub-Saharan Africa, and the good news is off-grid solar is a very small market right now, but it's growing at 40 to 60% a year, depending on the region you're in, within either Africa or Asia, India, etc. A project I'm working on right now is looking at shipping, the goal is to ship about $1 billion, a gigawatt worth of energy, multi-billion-dollar project, to 10 million people. And the distribution and partnering, it is a for-profit enterprise in an emerging Asian country, and will primarily rely on microfinance and micropreneurs in many of these schemes and environments. Those are primarily women who end up being the trusted keepers, if you will, in these micropreneurs. So there actually is good news, and there's an exponential force of growth that's going on under the hood that is promising. So I'm happy to talk with people who are interested in that.
Thanks. I just want to make a comment. When we're talking about the world's challenge on climate change, a lot of times a U.S. perspective is missing the real point, and it's really the perspective from places like sub-Saharan Africa, which is where all the CO2 emissions growth is going to happen in the future. Asia, it's the developing world. In the developed world, we've already reached peak CO2. This is true in Europe, it's true here in the United States, it's true in the developed world, and we're starting to see technology bring CO2 emissions down in the developed world. But in the developing world, to somebody who's living on $1 a day, to make an argument they should use their cell phone less, or they should, somehow conserve energy, it's just the wrong argument. So to me, what is working in the world right now to reduce CO2 emissions is technology. And the 3 E's that you talk about, where they all intersect, it's technology, and to make the energy affordable for somebody living in sub-Saharan Africa, the answer has always been technology. Some of the answers to the questions that you posed about, this all-consuming capitalist, constant growth economy, the only answer that potentially is technology. And we talked about regulations and what regulations do we, the ones that have worked have been the ones that have underwritten new technology with the certainty of return that we heard about from Nicaragua. And in places like Germany, some parts of the United States, where we've put in place the right incentives for the kind of technologies that we need to, solar, wind, etc. We see that private capital will come in and make an investment if they have a reasonable certainty of getting a return that drives the economies of scale to make the technologies work for people like sub-Saharan Africa. So I think it's so important to, first of all, take the viewpoint of the developing world, not the viewpoint of the developed world, and secondly, to understand the crucial role of technology in solving all these problems.
I'm going to show you a couple of things that we're doing. So we put together these little 10-watt panels. And this is enough to charge every day. You put that on the outside of the house, you put this on the inside, and you can charge AA, AAA batteries in your cell phones. So your point is to scalability. Take the need, or take the tools and drive it into where it costs less than the cost of lighting with kerosene. And then you take, and I don't know if you've ever seen SteriPins. Okay, so this little guy runs on AA, AAA batteries, and if you put this in clean water, and I'll show it to you later, and you turn it on, it nukes the bugs in the water. So you make water, there's no reason to have cholera. All right, you run water through sand so it gets clear, and then you nuke the bugs in it. These are things that are affordable at and less than it would cost to light your house with kerosene lamps. And the fellows back here have these little lights back here. All of these things can charge off of that. And then here's an example of a little solar thermal oven. All right? And you can cook. You can actually broil in this thing. And these are all very, very affordable if you take and you scale it to the needs of a mother and her children. Okay, so part of it, I put scalability in here. One other thing that I would like to add to this, because from my point of view, the reason that we have climate change is not capitalism, but the U.S. federal government monopolized power and transportation in the 1900s, and so when FDR put out the Rural Electrification Administration in 1935.
You have to say who he is.
Oh, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It wiped out 600,000 windmills and the entire distributed energy industry. So there's a really great quote from Thomas Edison in 1910. And he was saying, "To me, sunshine and electricity look a lot the same. They're both spread out really thin." And what he said is, what I had to do with electricity was gather it all up and hold it long enough to light a bunch of little lights. He says, do we use sun and wind? He says, oh no, we burn wood and coal like renters burn the front fence. We live like squatters, not like we own the property. And someday somebody's going to invent a way to gather all the energy we need from natural sources and store it in unlimited quantities in our local communities, and electricity will be as cheap as oxygen. And that is exactly what we can do. And we can do it 30% by 2020, 40% by 2025, or 60% by 2025, 80% by 2030, and there's no reason that we can't scale to your needs and get it so that you start small and then iterate relentlessly on a distributed basis. I mean, think of the internet as a distributed collaborative network. How do we build a distributed collaborative power and transportation network?